Welcome, everyone, to Moving Along. We have the great honor of speaking to Professor Jon Stoessl, who is at the University of British Columbia. He is our beloved editor-in-chief of the Movement Disorders Journal of our amazing Movement Disorder Society here. And he is the winner of the Marsden Lecture Award at the meeting that just happened in 2025 in Hawaii. We will refer a few times to a beautiful podcast that was recorded by Michele Matarazzo with Professor Stoessl as part of our podcast series. And also, we'll also link to the actual lecture that was a beautiful lecture that was delivered by Professor Stoessl. So we hope that you can check those out. And we will now ask a series of maybe a little out of the box questions to you now. Welcome, Jon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we were joking a little bit about the fact that C. David Marsden was his name, and the person whose award, the name of the award that you just received, and that many folks in our society tend to use their middle name and not their first name. Maybe you could tell us about what your observations of that are.
Well, I'm not sure I can come up with a list of names right now, but of course, the other well-known individual was Warren Olano, who was C. Warren Olano, and I, as it happens, have gone through life using my middle name or a contracted version of my middle name. The full would be Jonathan, but nobody ever calls me that unless I've been really bad, which I guess happens fairly frequently.
That's hilarious. Well, congratulations on the award. And the lecture was amazing. I mean, I think it shows the contribution of just so much of, the neuroimaging and your career. You've also been this amazing editor of this journal for so long and been, I think, a beautiful mentor and leader for many of us. And we've looked up to you, and you have influenced my own career and allowed me to publish a couple of things in the journal. Against perhaps your better sort of thoughts, but
Don't think so. Never.
I appreciate that. So I think one of the things that you had talked about is sort of your, it sounds like almost awe for the brain, and you mentioned in the podcast about the brain as a cathedral. Can we kind of spend a moment, if you would, to sort of explore that a little bit? Tell me a little bit about your thoughts there.
Well, simply that we're very fortunate. I think the brain, most of us presumably went into neurology or neuroscience because we were intrigued by the brain. And as scientific techniques and methodologies advance, we're fortunate that we can delve a bit deeper and understand more. Because unlike any other organ in the body, the brain is truly fascinating and in many ways beyond comprehension. And I think I was just trying to say that despite all the advances, which are great and important, um, we also want to never lose this sense of wonder of how amazing is this. And in many ways, I just feel, okay, I want to understand a little bit more, but not too much more. Because I want to be left with this appreciation that the brain is different, and that there are things that we will probably never fully understand.
So the sense of awe, curiosity, as if you're going into a
Absolutely,
cathedral and just being wowed by the complexity, the beauty,
absolutely, yeah,
and sort
yeah,
of the history of this place. I feel the same way. I think it's really, so I feel like the more we learn, the more we realize that we have so much more to learn, right? But we have made
exactly.
several advances, and I think I think there's just such an amazing sort of mix of things that our patients bring to us, and that we as scientists and researchers can also sort of continue to, it's an endless ocean, I think, and vast ocean in some ways. So well, thank you for that. One other area that I think has been just super fascinating to me, from your work is this study of, which I think was kind of almost an accident that came about, I guess, around the placebo effect. And can you maybe describe that sort of experiment and what they led you to think?
So this was work that was really spearheaded by Raul de la Fuente Fernandez. And we had started the experiment. I wrote a grant, and the study was done for relatively mundane reasons. We wanted to look at, I think, differences between people with fluctuations and or dyskinesias in terms of their sensitivity to affinity of dopamine receptors. And because we didn't have PET ligands that would do that specifically, we went to look at their response to apomorphine. So scientifically valid, but well, pretty much in keeping with other work that had been done. And then Raoul realized that there was a difference in the baseline, if you will, scans. And so we started looking at potential reasons, and he discovered that people who'd received saline as their baseline had very different values from those who'd received nothing. So that, of course, as soon as he pointed that out to me, of course, it didn't take long to figure out what the significance of that was, and then we set out to basically reproduce that. So it was a stroke of luck, and it was also a bit out there. And so I did spend many years lying awake, worrying that nobody would ever be able to reproduce it. And of course, it has been reproduced since in other ways by Fabrizio Benedetti and Antonio Strafella using different approaches. So, and then of course the other issue is the relevance to clinical practice and to the design of clinical trials. And so that was work. The design relevance is work that was carried on by Sarah Lidstone, who you may know as a movement disorders neurologist interested in functional disorders, but she actually, before medical school, I was fortunate to have her as a PhD student. And so we looked at what would happen if you gave people different stated expectations. There was a reason. A paper had come out that led us to do this study. And it turned out that the strength of the placebo effect was A, driven very much by how much of a chance people thought they had of getting active drug versus placebo. And B, it was strongly linked to the verum response. In other words, the true response to levodopa. And this is in terms of looking at short-term dopamine release. And that has huge implications, I think, for clinical trial design, because there is not one single placebo effect, and the placebo effect is going to depend to a very large degree on what people expect. So even if you compare a trial where people are told they might get symptomatic benefit as opposed to a trial where people are told this might have a disease modifying effect, you can imagine the expectations are completely different in that design. I actually see this as a problem, a potential problem with platform designs where you're looking to a common placebo group, but I'm not sure that the placebo effect would necessarily be equivalent across the different interventions.
Wow, that is so interesting. So I guess, that brings us to some of the work that I've been sort of working around, which is to, when we give the diagnosis, for example, of Parkinson's to a patient. And, historically, I think the patients have come away with the fact that we just say, you have Parkinson's, sorry, here's a pill, come back, in 6 months. And they end up Googling things and going down this sort of very negative pathway. And in our paper, we wrote about, giving the diagnosis of Parkinson's with compassion and hope. And I know Bas Bloom has written about hopamine as a
Yeah.
drug. And I read a book about hope that you were
Yeah.
actually featured in. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about hope and your sense of this.
The book on hope is on the bookshelf behind me, actually, but it's been a long time since that came out, and I haven't really. But yeah, absolutely. And we do this every day in our practice. I hope we do. every day in our clinical practice. It's always a tough balance because on the one hand, you are ethically obliged to be as truthful as possible, but at the same time, you never want to take away hope. And so I think there's probably and the correct balance in my own view, just talking about clinical practice, probably shifts over the course of the illness. If you're disclosing an early diagnosis, I think you want to focus on the hope and the fact that there are treatments available and that it's an active area of research and so on. And then as time goes on and some of the realities of advanced Parkinson's become impossible to ignore, then I think the conversation shifts, at least in my own practice. And at this point, I'm only seeing people with advanced disease, or for the greatest part. And so it's more a discussion of how can we make your life more fulfilling and meaningful, recognizing that we cannot fix all the problems that plague you. I think there's a huge difference, and we've kind of always known this in our hearts. Finding the evidence is not as straightforward as one might like, that people who have a positive attitude do better than those people who kind of give up right away. And I think that extends well beyond Parkinson's and even beyond other neurological or psychiatric diagnoses. And I've long been intrigued by it because I think we see people who do better, and something about them dictates that.
Yep. Yep. I call it the secret sauce. But I think it's also sort of how we are wording this and giving this to folks. It just also given sort of what you spoke about with the placebo experiments, it's sort of, of Sarah's, it sounds like there's sort of this sense of, this will help you, this will, we can help you. We will be this together, you will do well, with this package of things that we're going to be giving you with self-management and things like that. I know she and I have been focusing somewhat on giving how to give that message better, in order to help people to not feel like they're dealing with a hopeless situation and get demoralized. Um,
Yeah.
so so I think that balance is something that I think we're even now in 2025 just learning about. Even despite the fact that I think some of those placebo studies came out quite a long time ago, right?
Yeah, around 25 years,
Wow. So shifting a little bit to another thing that you talked about in your podcast interview, and I know it's been something that you've really been active and not just talking about, is the concept of mentorship. And I think some of the other award winners that have also gotten this Marsden Award, and I think Marsden himself was, quite an active mentor, and has the legacy of the folks that he's touched is have been pretty amazing. One of the other award winners was Mark Hallett, who was an amazing mentor to many as well. So maybe you could just speak a little bit about that mentorship.
Well, I would never place myself in the same category as those people who were, true giants. I did not work with Marsden, but I did have the privilege of spending some time with him. And my first direct exposure was actually giving a platform talk at the American Academy of Neurology meeting when my boss, my mentor, was not in the meeting. And I was presenting something fairly controversial, a controversial idea, and Marsden was chairing. And so I was intimidated. And he was actually very supportive. And then over time, I encountered him in a few other venues, and he was an extraordinary clinician with a highly inquisitive mind, and constantly looking at the links between the fundamental mechanisms that contribute to clinical observations, and also an exceptionally hard worker. I remember spending a day with him that was exhausting for everyone else, and I left his office when he was at King's College. I think it was 8 p.m. on a Friday, and he was still staying behind at his desk. Um, you mentioned Mark Hallett, and others knew him much better. He had masses of trainees who it's very clear from the messages that have appeared in the last few days that he was deeply loved and respected. Well known, obviously, again, for his scientific contributions, but I remember him for some touches. One was when he was an associate editor at Brain, when I've only appealed between one and three papers in my life, decisions. And this was one where I thought it was a bit of an odd decision. And so I emailed him and I was very apologetic about it. And he emailed back and said, I'm traveling now. I'll get back to you. I return on whatever day it was, and I'll get back to you. And he, sure enough, uh, he phoned. And I thought, well, you've barely just landed. And the fact that he would actually take the trouble to do that and discuss it with me stuck in my mind. And the other thing may seem like a small thing, but it was again at an academy meeting where we were sitting in the movement disorder session, and he had a book, a very large book that was a review course notes thing for the AA exam. And I thought, well, this guy is probably one of the best known, if not the best known person in the world for this material. And I said, what are you doing with this? And he said, I'm preparing for the exam. And I said, but you don't have to. You literally wrote the book on the subject. And he said, well, we call upon our more junior people to do it. I think that I need to set the example by doing it. He did not make a big deal of this. He was just carrying it around with him, not trumpeting it. And I thought, how many people in his position would behave that way? It really had a lasting effect on me.
Wow, that's amazing. So tell me about your concepts of mentorship. I know you've had a number of mentees. Tell me a little bit about, what I can be, what can I distill in my career to be a better mentor, maybe?
Uh, well, I've been very fortunate. I mean, as I look back on my career, I think the high points have really been related to the wonderful trainees. Um, and of course, it's a chemistry thing in many ways. It's somebody who's got an inquisitive mind who will come to you with new ideas. And from a mentorship perspective, I don't know that I can identify the secret sauce. I think the best thing you can do as a mentor is to encourage people to question everything. And it's actually an issue in medicine where people are fed a bunch of factoids and then accept them as truth. And of course, if you look over the course of my career, the things that were given truths when I was a medical student, people would laugh at now. And so you really want to encourage people to say, is this really the case? And to also look at material more critically because stuff appears in journals. The truth is that most of the time you may look at the title of the abstract, you're unlikely to really delve into it. And yet when you dig into things, you may discover that it's not quite as obvious as people would like to have you believe.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. This has been so edifying. I really appreciate you mentoring me and just being a very, available and accessible, sort of person to bounce ideas off of, and just somebody who I can always count on to make me laugh as well. So, which is not everyone. It's a rare quality. So I appreciate that in you. Congratulations on the award, and I look forward to what your career brings us next. It's just always been very very amazing, all of your body of work and what you continue to work around. So appreciate
Well, thank you very much. I feel I've been very blessed.